who has heard about SolidJS, who has used SolidJS, and who has watched Dune? Yeah, this question confuses some of you. Because I want to make a small comparison. Because, you see, 6 years ago, Solid showed everyone the way, showed everyone the path. And this path was all about fine-grained reactivity. This is a slide that I stole from my previous speaker, Attila. Thank you for this slide, because it saved me time on implementing this. And the thing that Solid showed the way was all about fine-grained reactivity. You see, we had these systems who were more coarse-grained reactive. Things like React and other frameworks, libraries, however you want to call them. I won't go into this discussion. They used to be more coarse. This meant that the framework had to run code to identify what changed on the UI and then run code to update it. Whilst when you have a fine-grained reactive system, you have this primitive called signals that enables you to basically not need to run code to update the UI. The signals just tell the framework, hey, update this specific part. And this is basically, in a very, very small nutshell, how fine-grained reactivity works. And this is where we started 6 years ago. This is where we were when Solid first showed up to the world. And this is where we are right now. Almost everyone is all aboard with fine-grained reactivity. Almost everyone saw the value of signals. So it took a while, but this is basically where we are right now. And it was not just us, the developers, that won. Our users also won because of this, because our apps are more performant, they seem snappier, and, well, for the developers, we have a better developer experience and a clearer mental model. Now, while this was happening, there was another discussion that showed up, well, 2-3 years ago, something like that, and it was all about the server. We were wanting to bring stuff back to the server, stop having stuff running on the client. Server-side rendering now was a topic. Everyone wanted to do server-side rendering. And frameworks had to adapt. They had to have a way to start having server-side rendering. Now, there was an option. You could do this by, well, if you're using React or Create React app, you could eject your application. You could configure Webpack. But that stuff hurts. I don't like doing it. And the easiest way was probably jumping all the way the sandworms, which in this case are the meta frameworks. You cannot see there on the left because of the subtitles, but there's the Vue logo, because that's one of the Vue's meta frameworks next. For Angular, we have Analog, and here for React, we have Next. Now, these meta frameworks, for you who are not familiar to what they are basically frameworks built on top of frameworks. And they bring you, first of all, a better developer experience, some opinionated stuff, and these things with multiple rendering modes. So now we had stuff easily interchangeable with server-side rendering, client-side rendering, yada, 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 yada. There was a bunch of stuff. Now, when these meta frameworks started popping up, there was one question that everyone was asking. What about Solid? Where does Solid fit into the meta framework discussion? Because no one knew what was our sandworm. No one knew what's going to be the thing that Solid would use to hop into the meta framework discussion. Well, in 2021, Vite 2.0 came out. That same week, Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid, said, let's build a meta framework. And he created SolidStart. So this is where I'll start my presentation. I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm not going to introduce myself again, just telling you some other stuff about me that I haven't said yet, which is I wrote a book last year about React Query, 10-stack query React adapter. That's how we can describe it. I wrote a book about it last year. I released a course on Egad.io about React testing library, and you cannot see it again because it's cut. I've been maintaining this newsletter that's this month in Solid, where we will go over everything that happened in the previous month in SolidJS ecosystem. Actually, I just released my newsletter, 4th issue, yesterday. So if you want to check it out, please feel free to. There's this QR code here that you should be able to scan if you want to get more information on this. Either way, you can also go to my social media. I'm Daniel Afonso everywhere, so you can basically find me. Now, bringing back the topic of the discussion, which is why do we need a meta framework? I could spend a couple of hours talking about this, but I decided to just at these 6 topics. You see, meta frameworks are not just about rendering modes. They're not just about deployment adapters. They're about, well, having an improved developer experience, having proper guidelines, opinionated guidelines, and all these things will basically help you have a faster time to production. It will help you ship faster with hopefully more quality. Now, there's one keyword here that when people start talking about frameworks, that's what people start getting triggered, which is opinionated. You see, there's this idea in the JavaScript ecosystem, and that's what I can speak for because that's where I feel like I belong and where I'm hanging out, that when you have something opinionated, you don't have freedom. People don't like being locked into stuff. People like to, well, if I could change libraries every 2 weeks or so. Obviously, that's not viable, but that's something that we like, I would say. And when you have something that's opinionated, you lose the freedom. I can give you a small example. 2 years, wow, it's been 2 years ago. 2 years ago, this meta framework from one ecosystem released a new router. And when that router released, everyone was losing their minds because now, like, oh, there's new stuff, I have to learn this stuff. It's opinionated, I don't like it, I want to be free, I want to use whatever I want. And I'll come back to this part in a bit because I want to center the question again. What about Solid? What about Solid's meta framework? I told you that when Vite2 came out, that week Ryan started working on SolidStart. But this was in 2021. It has been 3 years. Well, SolidStart went to multiple rewrites, 2 beta phases, because we wanted to build the best thing ever. Ryan and the core team from Solid said, okay, we want this meta framework to be the shape of frameworks to come. That's the way that they want to show to other frameworks, to the other ecosystems. And since, well, Attila has already spoiled this, 2 weeks ago, SolidStart V1 was released. So now it's stable. There was this concern that, oh, the app is still not stable, so I don't want to give it a shot. Now it's stable. It's there. You can give it a shot. Just do npm, npm, whatever, create Solid, and you have your CLI to customize your application. Now, let's talk a bit more about SolidStart, because SolidStart is all about composability. And what do I mean about composability? I also stole this slide from Attila. Composability, it's about, well, I'm getting a bit ahead. Meta frameworks are about 4 things, or 5. The UI library, or framework, the router, the bundler, the server runtime, and, in this case, a serializer. And these are the things that compose a meta framework. And in SolidStart's case, this is what we have. We have Solid as the UI library. We have Serval, which is our serializer that we had to build, basically from scratch, because it's super powerful and it needed support stuff that other serializers didn't. I wish I could talk more about it. You can ask Attila about it because he knows way more about Serval than I do. Because this thing is crazy, it's super advanced, and okay, it makes my head hurt just trying to process everything. But either way, then we have Vinci. Vinci is basically the bundler and the server runtime wrapper that we have. It's basically built on top of Vite and built on top of Nitro. So Vite is basically our bundler and Nitro is our server API. Vite basically allowed SolidStart to be created. It's the thing that gave hope to Ryan and said, okay, let's build this thing. Nitro, on the other side around, the reason why we went with it is because it's the same thing that Analog is using, it's the same thing that Nuxt is using. And one thing that I've learned about the SolidJS ecosystem, even before I joined the DX team, was we're all about learning and growing from each other. And because Nitro, it's being used by these other meta frameworks, we got to contribute together, we got to learn from each other, and we get to have this stable foundation that, well, hopefully if one of us finds an issue, that will help all the others. And this is basically, I could throw a Mandalorian reference, the Solid way. And then we have our router. We have Solid Router, which is basically the thing that had already existed before SolidStart. And when I said that SolidStart is composable, it is because we tend, and one of the intentions that Ryan had very much in mind when building SolidStart was, I don't want it to be opinionated. I want to have freedom here. I want people to say, if I don't like Solid Router, I want to bring my own router. I can bring 10-stack router if I want. As long as I could make my own router, as long as that router can speak SolidStart, so there might need to be some changes, you can take Solid Router out. You can swap these things for something that you want. There's not the freedom aversion to it. We want to be free, and this is what we have. Now, enough talking about how SolidStart works. Some of you are thinking, okay, yeah, this is pretty cool, but what are the features? What does it do? And now I will try to do a small demo that the last time I presented it in 40 minutes, so I'm going to try to do it in 10. So let's figure out how this works. Okay, let me just open Visual Studio Code. Before anything else, this is the application that I'll be playing with. So I work at OLX, and one of the products that we develop at OLX is Sun Virtual. And basically, this is a very, 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 very dumb version of Sun Virtual where you can just add cars, see cars information. So if I click here, I should be able to see my car information. If I go back, I go back. So we have routing. And if I come here, I can add a car. I could show you adding. I'll show you adding, but let's not jump ahead. So this is basically the application that we'll be working with today. Now, let's open our SolidStart app. Let's put this full screen so people in the back can see. I'm just going to close everything here, get back to our app config. And our app config is where everything starts. This is basically our Vinci wrapper that's going to basically expose Vite, Nitro, and you can expose your configurations. Here I'm just going to disable SSR for a bit because I want to show you this working in a single page application, which is what most people, the majority, might have. So we're building a single page application right now. Okay, so our application will start with our app TSX. Our app TSX is basically where we expose the router and where everything starts in our application. So we have our router there, and this router is wrapping basically a main where we have the image from Sun Virtual and a suspense boundary. Basically, whenever we're loading a route, there can be some, the route might suspend, so while we're loading the data, there's going to be a fallback showing loading, and then it's going to be rendered inside of props children. So for those of you who have used React, this might be very familiar. It's also JSX. And then here we have this thing called file routes. You see, file routes is very peculiar and it's very important because it's here to solve one of the issues that bother us in web development. But the way, before jumping any steps, file routes is here basically to tell Solid, okay, we need to load some pages. And how does this work? Well, we look into this routes folder here, and if we want to render the index page, which is our slash page, we're going to have our index component. If you want to render the new page, which is going to be our form, we have the new component. And if you want to render like cars/ID, which is basically the number that we want to fetch from the database to get our data and load it, we use this syntax here. So basically, we have square brackets ID, close square brackets TSX, and basically what this is going to do is look at the URL, grab the ID, inject it here, and then we can use it for data fetching. Now, this by itself, it's not very exciting. What's exciting is basically what file routes does. Because let's imagine a typical application. First, we render our index, which is in this case our app config. Then inside of our index, we're going to render our page, which is going to be one of those components. So we fetch the index, we fetch the page, and then our page is going to need some data. So then we fetch the data. And there's this waterfall starting to happen. And this basically affects the initial page load of our application because, well, if you have to do all this data fetching, your page is going to take longer to load. And this affects conversion. This affects companies, and this takes money away when pages take time to load. SolidStart fixed that. So basically, the app and the index boundary, so these two layers, can be fixed with the help of the bundler. The bundler can be smart enough to figure out, okay, we need to add some preload tags to these components, so we can fetch them in parallel. The way we can fix the data loading scenario, it's by using this thing called loaders. Loaders allow the data to be, first of all, preloaded, and basically this means that while the page, the index and the page are loading, the data for the page is also loading at the same time. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, you have 1. All the 3 layers are fetched at the same time. Also, file routes does one thing super cool as well, which is it lazy loads all the components for you. You don't have to use React, the thing with Solid that's Solid lazy, which is very similar to React lazy. You don't have to use this to do code splitting because file routes is smart enough to figure out, okay, this needs to be lazy loaded, so let's wrap it automatically. I told you about loaders. So loaders, in this case, can be exposed from one page by saying, okay, export route, and from this route we have a loader. And in this loader we get cars. And that's basically what we're doing here. We're saying, okay, for this route we're going to need this data. And we're going to fetch it, preload it. For instance, I can show you this working here. Just go over here, inspect. I'm going to zoom this a bit. If I go to my network tab, there should be, if I over this, you should see that there was a request happening here. So I don't know why it's failing. I don't know if I killed the server. But basically, there's the preload fetching. So what would happen here is there's a preloading. I click. Here we already have the data. Now, there's a reason why we already have the data here, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Because inside of this component, we also have create a sync, which is basically a solid router primitive that allows you to turn a promise into a signal. That's basically what this does. And this create a sync also basically calls our function getCars, which is our query to the database to get our data. Now, this is where the fun story begins, because who here has used the Remix? Just a question, okay. Some people use Remix. In Remix, when you have loaders, you have to basically, you return your data from the loader, and then you use this thing called use loader data. And from that, you have access to the data that your loader returned. This is not how it works. Because if you have used Remix, and then you're using TypeScript, you're going to figure out that, every time I return something from the loader, I have to do like type of loader, just to make sure that our data knows what data is. So there's some type safety constraints that we need to be handled in Remix. In Solid, we didn't want it to do that. We wanted to basically, I fetch data there, and I fetch data there. And now you might be asking, but Daniel, doesn't that mean you're going to fetch data twice? It does. Ideally, we would have something like 10-stack query, or React query, where basically what it does, it's a cache layer built on top of your network layer. So when you get the data, you cache it. That's a very short description of how it works. So that's what we built. Inside of our getCars, which is basically our function to fetch some data, this function is wrapped with cache. And then we have a query key here. So what this is going to do, it's going to fetch this data, cache it under cars, and this means that when the preload request it and the loader request it at the same time, this is going to be smart enough to tell you, okay, there's already this promise running, we're going to wait for this promise to finish, and we're going to get the same data to both of you. And that's basically how cache boundary works. Now, there's something here that you might find interesting, because there's this thing here that says use server. Ooh, what is use server actually? That's a question that a lot of people have asked themselves. Oh, it's there to run stuff on the server. Yes, but most of all, use server, it's an annotation for the bundler. It's there to tell the bundler, hey, whenever you see this tag, this part of the function is going to be extracted and only be executed on the server. So if you have a client-side rendered application like the one we have, what's going to happen is, because this function needs to run on the server, there's going to be an RPC call from the client to the server. The server fetches the data and then returns the data via the RPC call. This is if we're doing client-side rendering. If we're doing server-side rendering, it just runs everything on the server, renders it there, and then you get the page. That's a bit the gist of how use server works here. Now, I still have 6 minutes. Okay, so basically here we have what it's called a server function, because this function is always going to be running on the server, and then the data is going to be cached under cars. The same thing happens to getCar, which is the function to get an individual car, and then cache it under the query key car. Now some of you might ask, but this is going to get multiple cars. How do you cache it only under single query key car? Well, because we have a parameter here, which is ID, what cache is going to do is get this ID and serialize it together with the query key. So there's going to be car/1 or something like that. So it's going to always cache it under that thing. And this is basically data fetching in caching. Now, let me figure out where I was in my story. Okay, so I showed you the index, fetching data, create a sync, there's a cache boundary here, so it makes sure that when we preload data, it won't refetch a bunch of times. And also, another very cool thing about create a sync is this thing is going to be type safe, because we're using the exact same function that we use to create the data on the server. We're going to be able to know what everything is with the help of TypeScript, which is pretty cool and one thing that we would lose if we were just using like a fetch call and an API route, which you can still build because SolidStart is a meta framework, so you can have API routes if you so desire. I have 4 minutes, and I just wanted to show you the thing that really excites me now. So let's look at our form, shall we? And I still don't know why this thing is failing. Oh, I know why it's failing. Let me restart the client. So let's load everything again, and let's add a new car. So we're getting into the mutations territory. And in mutations, in this case, we have an action, which actions are the ways that you can be called inside of a form, and this thing will do an action. We're going to do something really cool here, because let's visualize how forms and how submissions work. Usually, you have you execute a mutation, which is the post request to your server, and we expect, okay, this needs to create data on the server. Cool. So when the post finishes, the client then figures out, okay, I want to go back to my index page, which I don't want to stay on the form. So I want to go back to my index. And then when you get to the index, you're going to have to load the data again. So there we go again. 1, 2, 3, waterfalls. And we don't like that. So let's look what happens when I submit this data, shall we? We're expecting those 3 waterfalls, those 3 requests. So brand, I have no zero about cars. So if these models don't exist, don't judge me. I don't know the pricing here. And I'm just going to put a bunch of stuff because there's some form validation here. Is Tejas trying to pronounce this? He was trying to pronounce this. This was really cool. Sorry, the view from here is super fun. So let's create a car. There was only 1 request. How? What's happening here? Why is there only 1 request? Well, this is the power of something that SolidStart has that I really, really love. Sorry if I get excited. It's called single flight mutations. What's happening here is when you send a request to the server, and now let's look into the code, because now I need to show you this. When we call our action here, that's the add car, what's going to happen is this action knows it needs to update data on the database, but this action also knows that it needs to redirect to the index page. And this is the power of having a router that knows all your needs, because what's going to happen is it does the mutation, it sends the next page already to the client, so what the client gets is the next page, and at the same time starts fetching the data on the server and streams it in. That's basically the power of single flight mutations, all in a single flight. This thing is crazy, crazy exciting. I just love it so much. What haven't I shown you yet? I still have 2 minutes. So, well, let's disable JavaScript, shall we? Because this is a meta framework stuff, so we need to disable JavaScript. Disable JavaScript. Let's run. And we have no application. Anyone knows why? Exactly. This is a single-page application. We're doing client-side rendering. I disabled server-side rendering in the beginning. This has all been done from the traditional application that we have nowadays. So now if I wanted, I could go back to my app config, and I can just say true. I wouldn't even need to do this because by default it's the server-side rendering. And if the dev server is working, the JavaScript is still disabled, and everything still works. Progressive enhancement. That's all that it's about. So now I believe I showed you everything. If I forgot something, I would love to chat a bit more. I'll be here all day. And let me open my last slide. So, play. Cool. So I showed you some of these things. I didn't show you stuff like optimistic updates. I think I showed you pretty much everything. But there's many other stuff that SolidStart enables you. There's an experimental islands on the way. It's already there, but it's being worked on. There's heck, now my brain stopped working, but we have so many, many things that are not here that allows us to build like the best experience when we're building solid applications. You see, SolidStart provides us with the meta framework experience that we wanted, without like the convention lock-in that we would expect from other meta frameworks. There is a reason why we say SolidStart is the shape of frameworks to come. Don't like the router? Swap it out. Don't like a specific convention? Don't use it. We give you the primitives for you to build whatever you want and the freedom for you to do whatever you want. Start is here to help you build better with quality production-ready applications. This is, well, this is a start of something exciting, I could say. There's no opinion, no lock-in, just a based start. So with that said, and I'm finishing right on time, this was my time, and I hope to see what you're going to do with SolidStart.